to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's a podcast host too, like me, and of course, the author of the book Virtualization Defined, no other than Mr. Dave Sobel.
Well, nice to meet you. Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Dev, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure. My name is Dave Sobel. I'm the host of the Business of Tech podcast. It is a daily news and commentary show focused on the delivery of IT services. I spent about a decade running a managed services provider firm, and then I spent another nearly 8 years running and operating teams at software vendors that served the space. And so now I report and do analysis for those providers to give them insights of the day and what they need to know to run their business. I ask the question, why do we care about the stories that we cover?
Why do we care, people? This is a number big question. Mr. Dave Sorrell, thank you so much for sharing your talent to the world. So, what inspired you to write Virtualization Defined?
Well, I wrote the book during the time when I was running my managed services provider because at the time virtualization was a newer technology and we were focused on interesting solutions to help small and mid-sized organizations use the technology in their business. So there was no books at the time on it, particularly focused on those smaller and mid-market companies. So I wanted to give some insights into the way the technology could be used, some of the best ways that we were using it in my business, and then give some guidance to other consultants on how they could use it. So that was the intention behind the book.
So, for the readers unfamiliar with the term, how would you define virtualization in simple terms?
So, in simple terms, the idea of virtualization is we're separating the software from the hardware. In particular, most of the time, we're all very used to the idea of our computers run an operating system, and it's really just tied to that particular piece of hardware. But what we can actually do is we can use some special software that puts a layer between the hardware and the software, making that operating system much more portable. That allows us to do some really interesting things, particularly in a time before the cloud was as ubiquitous as it is now.
Yes.
We could be much more flexible about the way we deployed systems. Now, most of the time, these systems would be deployed purely in the cloud. But at the time, that was the idea. We could make these operating systems very portable. It allows us to separate aging hardware from the software layer and do some really interesting stuff.
So, Mr. Dave, what are the core benefits of virtualization for small to medium sized businesses?
Well, so at the time, the idea was that you could separate out the operating systems and the applications that were living within them from the hardware below. And so that made it so that, say, for example, you were running your business, and in the at the time in sort of the early aughts, we were oftentimes having servers in our offices, and then we could make it so that we could move the software from one piece of hardware to another without having to reconfigure everything. It was a much easier way to do that. Of course, now you and I are talking in 2025, most small to mid-sized businesses would be deploying these systems in the cloud. And virtualization was also a really good bridge to move those on-premise servers into the cloud because we could separate out from the hardware and then we could move it straight into the cloud.
Interesting, Mr. Dave. So, how has virtualization evolved in recent years, especially for SMBs?
Well, for SMBs, it's a lot less useful because these days we don't recommend nearly as much hardware into a small customer. And in fact, what virtualization does now is it powers most of the data centers that we think about for our major cloud services. So, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, they all have a component of virtualization running in those data centers. So, you can see the seeds of what I was talking about back then during the book have now evolved into the way that we deliver cloud technologies now. So for most small customers, usually I'm recommending that they look at cloud-based solutions for their software rather than looking at anything on-prem that might be using virtualization.
Interesting indeed, Mr. Dave. So, what are the biggest misconceptions SMB consultants have about virtualization?
Well, one of the big things, the conceptions at the time when I was writing the book, was the fact that it was difficult to use and it was complex. And in fact, it's a mature technology. It's got a long history that dates 40 years back. So it's a very mature technology. I said nowadays it powers most cloud data centers in most ways. So it's gone on to do even bigger things in terms of what we do. So the misconception is that the technology went away. It didn't. In fact, it's gone into most of the technologies that we use in the cloud today.
Yes, still existing and evolve. In your experience, what's the biggest challenge consultants face when introducing virtualization to small business?
Well, ultimately, it's oftentimes the fact that customers are not particularly fluent in the technologies themselves. In fact, most of the time, I advise most IT consultants to not be talking about the technologies to their customers and instead be talking to them about the business outcomes that they get. Most customers are not buying things because the technology is cool. They're buying because they want to solve a particular problem. And so the biggest misconception is the fact that if you're focusing on the technologies, you're actually missing the important conversation with those customers.
So, what types of SMB clients benefit the most from virtualization solutions?
Well, these days they'd be benefiting from it in the use of their cloud technologies. So the back
Yes.
ends, these data centers that are running so much virtualization, they're seeing the benefits of the technology in the way the cloud can be delivered. The fact that we can deliver technology that scales up and down as easily as it can. For example, you and I are talking on an electronic platform right now that's all delivered out of the cloud. The capacity of you and I could add tons more streams, you could have more guests. This is all a very dynamic technology that allows for that. That's all powered by the cloud. Ultimately, underneath it, the core of that is virtualization underneath all of those technologies.
So, do you think, Mr. Dave, if cloud is not invented, what do you think the option?
Well, that is a really big question. If cloud wasn't invented, in fact, we'd have to go back and we'd have to really decide where the cloud ended. Are we saying that the internet wasn't invented either? Because that is early form of the cloud was the two sets of computers talking to one another. I think technology would have gone in a very different way if the cloud hadn't been invented.
Totally agree. So, how can consultants effectively communicate the ROI of virtualization to skeptical clients?
Well, the question really speaks to the way you would deliver ROI conversations about any technology. And I think the real important piece is to link back to the way the customer's business works. I usually talk about this in terms of their profit and loss statement. Any business owner knows that you're running your business off of the profit and loss statement. So that's your revenue at the top, that's your removal of the cost of goods sold, you've got your profit margins in there, then you'll remove the administrative costs and you get your net profit at the bottom. You want to have a conversation with customers about what impact the technology can have at each part of that profit and loss statement. And I call it my good, better, best model of conversation about it. If you're having a conversation about helping them with their administrative costs, that's good. Customers like talking about saving money in those spaces. But if you're able to talk about helping them in their cost of goods sold, meaning the delivery of their service themselves, that's better. And if you can talk ultimately about top line revenue, that's best because you can make impact directly in the way that they grow their business, be it sell more widgets, serve more customers, be much more efficient, but their marketing, whatever that component is that's driving the top line, that's always the best conversation.
Very well said, Mr. Dave. Very well said. So, what's the difference between server virtualization and a desktop virtualization, and when should each be used?
Well, the idea behind that is whether or not you're the server, the centralized systems that are delivering those technologies, or the desktops, which are those endpoints that we're managing now. And the idea behind it is that you would make a decision about where it's used and how it is used. Now, in servers, generally we're delivering, the server applications and the line of business application are all wrapped around these virtualization components. And that is a much more scalable dynamic piece. In desktops, we would be doing it for a single user. Oftentimes these days, particularly as we're talking in 2025, I would be much more reticent to recommend virtualization at the desktop level because we have so many other ways of solving those problems now with software as a service or applications delivered out of the cloud. The solution might be something different. In the server realm, it's going to look much the way that it did even when I was writing the book, back during the time running my business. And so at that point, you'd be looking at the same technologies now. So the difference really is less about the technology and more about how we're using it.
So, Mr. Dave, how do cloud services factor into the virtualization conversation for SMBs?
Well, these days, as I said, the back end of most cloud services has some component of virtualization. I would advise most small businesses right now to not even worry about the technologies that are happening on the back end and just have conversations about what your what your needs are, your business needs, and then get matched to a proper technology. We can deliver so much just with software as a service over the internet right now from a technology perspective. We can generally solve most people's business problems with some clever thinking in the way that it implements. And on top of that, there's so much of this software that just works off the shelf. Again, you and I are talking on a platform that neither one of us had to do significant customizations to make it work. It all gets delivered out of the cloud. The same if you think about Google Workspace or Microsoft 365. These technologies come right off the shelf working in really efficient ways, and you don't have to think about the technology on the back end.
Certainly. So, what are the key technologies or platform that every SMB consultant should understand when it comes to virtualization?
Well, I think these days you'd be wanting to talk on a couple of different, for most SMB consultants right now, I want them to be focused on a couple of key technologies. The first I want them to focus on is the productivity layer. Like what's happening from a production, to make customers more efficient. That's more than just delivering email and delivering file services. That's about workflow. That's about the integration of artificial intelligence, those components. And then you're going to layer on top of that cybersecurity. You're going to have really smart conversations about the way you secure your customers to make sure they're not vulnerable to hackers, to ransomware, to phishing attacks. And you have to be on the constant vigilant outlook to make sure that that's not happening. So I think those are the two main pieces. And as I alluded to, like most of those services now on the back end are powered by technologies like virtualization.
So, Mr. Dave, can you share a real world example or case study where virtualization made a major impact on an SMB?
Yeah, so in particular, one that I always think of was a customer of mine that's a medical facility had difficult, tight budgets in terms of rolling systems out, and they had an aging server where on top of not only was the server aging, there was medically certified software that ran on top of that that needed to be running in a ongoing environment. So what we were able to do is we were able to wrap that operating system and that application in a virtualization layer and move that to much more modern hardware. And what we were able to do then is we were able to be really efficient about the way that we did backups and disaster recovery around that system so that in the event something happened, we could be much more fluid and fast about the way we were able to restore their systems. It gave them real flexibility in the way that they could approach their ongoing technology investments. And as they started considering moving to more modern systems, they were in a much better place because the hardware underneath it was all modern, fresh, and disaster recovery enabled.
So, what role does security play in virtual environments, and what should consultant watch out for?
Well, in fact, I would argue that security plays the same role across no matter what the technology is. And so these days, what we have to be worrying about is much more than simple backups or antivirus. We have to be very cognizant about the way that hackers are attacking systems. They're very automated now, and they work very much
Yes.
in very systemized, organized gangs. Their idea is to find any weakness in an organization, penetrate them, generally do some kind of ransomware or phishing attack in order to extract money. These are criminals looking for money. And so, what we have to do is we have to build businesses that are able to be resistant against those kinds of attacks. So, you've got to be both on the defense to make sure that you're all well prepared for the attack itself, but also ready for when the inevitable happens and you will fall to the hackers, because most people will be hacked over the course of their business operations. So you need to be in a position to be able to do a restoration, put systems back, have things prepared, have an incident response plan, all of the components of running the operation you need to be ready for. So from my perspective, cybersecurity is going to be the same regardless of the technology that we put into place. We're just going to be very heavily focused on the people and process component of that, and then layer on the right technologies to fit those needs.
Certainly, Mr. Dave. So, what will be your advice for those people out there who want to protect their business from fraud or from this cyber attack?
You're going to want to focus in on a layered security approach, and you're going to need to focus on all three components of that. That's people, that's process, and that's the technology beneath it. Now we'll start with the technology. That's the, having good backup and disaster recovery. You're going to have email security. You're going to want to have you're going to want to make sure that you've got endpoint protection on there. You're going to want to make sure your cloud services are protected. There's a component of that, but then on top of that, you're going to want to have good process. Your people are going to need to understand the fact that these these hackers are coming in with social engineering. They're going to try and trick you into doing things. So you have to have processes in place to be able to protect against that. And then you're going to want to invest in your people. You're going to want to invest actively in security training so that they understand and know how to look for the signs of attack, and they know the things that they're supposed to do, and then they don't feel ashamed also of reporting incidents, because it's really important that the entire organization be well prepared to address these. Obviously, I would recommend that any small business spend some time with their consultant working specifically to develop those plans for them, but that gives you a good sense of the overall thinking of the way you would approach this.
Thank you for your advice, Mr. Dave. And what will be your short term and long term goals as a podcast host, as well as in your writing?
Well, it's all about getting all the listeners, right? So for me, it's about continuing to be helping. I look at it from the perspective of I like helping, those IT consultants on a daily basis. I really spend a lot of good time. I could spend a lot of time worrying about getting every single listener, and I've got a really great audience that tunes in every day. But for me, the biggest, most important thing is giving them good advice every single day so that they can make choices in their business about where they're spending their time, and in some cases where they're not spending their time. I think about that, and I love hearing from listeners who tell me that they listen to the show, that they've taken the advice, and they've gone and implemented it in their businesses. That's the number one thing. Obviously, I'd like to continue to be a top 50 tech news podcast. Focus on delivering those pieces, have a continuing growing audience. But actually, the most rewarding piece, and the piece that I look for as a goal, is just making sure that I'm making a difference for my listeners every day.
Good luck to your goals, Mr. Dave, and thank you so much for sharing your podcast to the world. Let's empower the world itself through your knowledge. So, how do you recommend consultants assess a small business's readiness for virtualization?
Well, I think that it goes through the process that I recommend most of them do, and that's a general technology assessment process. I think anytime that a small business consultant is engaging with a potential customer, they need to be taking a look at the entire technology stack. They want to be talking to those business owners, talking about what the business's goals are, what their operational procedures are, what industries they are, dive into their business needs, and then take a look at their technology to make sure that it's matching to their needs. And I think virtualization would be a technology as part of that entire stack, no different than any other technology, be it a security technology or an artificial intelligence technology, a cloud technology. Doesn't really matter. In fact, you want to be focused on what the business needs are and make sure that their technology is matching to those needs.
So, Mr. Dave, what will be a virtualization after 50 years?
Oh, well, I think it's going to be one of those technologies that's just baked in. In fact, we're moving that way now, where most of the time we don't actually even think about the virtualization layer. It just happens in the background in the cloud data centers. And I think if we project out 50 years, it'll be even more so. We found that that's really the benefit of most of what we're seeing in cloud infrastructure in general. The fact that you don't even have to think about the servers and the processors and the hard drives that go into powering the technology that we use every day, that's virtualization that's doing that for you. And I just think it's going to continue to be baked into the technology that we use.
So do you think it will evolve more as the
Likely, all technology, it gets to a point of maturity, but continues to become better over time. We get better and faster at using it, much more efficient on the processing power, on energy usage, on storage usage. So I think it's just moving into, it's a very mature technology, and it'll just ultimately get iterated on over time.
So, Mr. Dave, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Law 101, in its first season, people, first season with Mr. Andy Samachuk. Please do listen to our latest episode. We are talking about Mr. Donald Trump global visa. So please do listen. Law 101, wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Dave, if you could give one piece of lasting advice to SMB consultants entering the virtualization space, what would it be?
Well, specifically on virtualization, I'd say spend your time on something else these days. I would actually implore them to go look at cloud technologies, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. If you're considering technologies, those are the ones that I think are have the most opportunity for SMB consultants right now. Particularly when we talk about technologies like virtualization that are very mature, there's not nearly as much opportunity now as there are in technologies that are less mature and ones that customers are asking for very actively now.
Mr. Dave Sobel, thank you so much for sharing your podcast, your book to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your podcast as well as your book?
Well, I'd appreciate that to join, take a listen to my podcast. It's called The Business of Tech. It's delivered every single business day. All the links to find me on every single platform, that's all the podcasters as well as on YouTube, are on my website at businessof.tech. Again, that is the website, businessof.tech.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Dave Sobel because if you support him, more and more and more empowering episodes to come. So, Mr. Dave, thank you so much for your time.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight.
More to come, people. See you soon.